Hey guys, happy Tuesday. Hope everyone's having a great week so far. I got some really good news for you. Today is going to be another pretty quick lesson. So we're going to speed through this guy and take the quiz afterwards, and you're done for my class for the day. So today is capitalism versus communism, really around the world. We're going to talk about the proxy wars that happened during the Cold War. Now, a proxy war, this is the literal Webster Dictionary definition, is a war, not a way, sorry, a war instigated by a major power which does not itself become involved. And we're talking about the Cold War. So we're really talking about wars that were kind of like between the USSR and the USA, though not directly between the USSR and the USA. What it really was a fight of capitalism versus communism. Now, some of the wars we're going to talk about are pretty famous wars: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Soviet-Afghan conflict. I'm not going to get super deep into them. My goal here is to paint a picture of just what the world was like during the Cold War, because next year in your U.S. history classes, you guys will get deep into the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So I'm just going to kind of go over them quickly. The first one is the first one is the Korean War. This is the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War because people just don't talk about it in the midst of World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. But the Korean War was just as deadly and just as influential, if not more, than the Vietnam War itself. It started in 1950, so only a couple years after World War II, and it happened because North Korea, which was communist, crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, which was pro-Western and becoming democratic at the time. The 38th parallel was just the line that North and South Korea had agreed upon with the help of some United States statesmen, like congressmen. They agreed on the 38th parallel, which is a line of latitude that would separate them. North Korea, with the backing of the USSR, crossed that line, and they went to war with South Korea. South Korea was backed by the USA at the time, and the USA sent troops almost immediately and began backing them in all sorts of ways, obviously politically, also economically. The casualties of the Korean War, there were 5 million casualties in total, and we'll see as a theme of these proxy wars is that more than half of the casualties, 2.5 million or more, were civilians. 40,000 U.S. troops died and 100,000 were wounded. And this is only in a 3-year period. This is a relatively short war. And with all those casualties and so many civilians dying, the sad part of this was that North Korea and South Korea are still split today, and no ground was really gained. This was called off so quickly, this war, in fear of starting another world war, which would have been World War III at the time, with the USSR and the USA so strongly backing this. They didn't want other countries to get involved as well. So it was called off, and as you guys know, North Korea is still communist, one of the more communist countries in the world now, and South Korea is still democratic. So the Korean War, high casualty rate, really low success rate for any major changes throughout Korea. We're also going to see that same idea in the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War was a 20-year conflict. It was a fight between North Vietnam, which was communist, and South Vietnam, which was pro-Western, again, becoming democratic. Now, the Vietnam War is much more publicized and much more talked about in the media, mainly because there were so many protests and so many attempts to get out of Vietnam that were just never fully seen or never fully happened. North Vietnam, again, was supported by China and the USSR. If you wonder what that noise was, Batman just clawed his way out of my room. North Vietnam was supported by China and the USSR. South Vietnam was supported by the USA and South Korea. The USA supported Southern Vietnam for the same reason they supported South Korea, but the domino theory was actually coined by Eisenhower, and Eisenhower said that if Vietnam fell to communism, then so would the rest of Asia, and then so would the rest of the world. He thought it was going to be a tipping point, a domino theory. Luckily, he was wrong about that. But 3 million people in total died. Again, more than half were civilians. So we're talking about 1.5 million civilians at least dying from this war. 58,000 Americans died, 18,000 more than the Korean War. But again, it's over a 20-year period. And there were just tons of protests in America over the Vietnam War. President after president decided or made a notion or an announcement that they would withdraw from Vietnam, from Kennedy to LBJ to Nixon, and Ford finally does. But these protests often got out of hand. The draft was instituted during the Vietnam War. And all of this, the country was being split in half just for a fight over communism in a distant part of the world. There was a famous riot in Ohio at Kent State, and where police officers were attempting to stop the riot and fired into the crowd, and 4 young college students died protesting the Vietnam War. And there's a pretty famous song by Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Neil Young that talk about this. And you can see this was a very famous song at the time. This was this shows the country. Hopefully, you guys can hear this. So if you guys see that, it's very provocative lyrics. Talking about Nixon cutting us down, 4 dead in Ohio. What would you do if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? It was talking about directly those 4 students that got killed at the protests. And imagine today hearing a song directly attacking the decisions that our president was making regarding a very important, a very decisive war going on that your country was associated with. This was pretty revolutionary and a pretty big deal. And this is only one of probably 20 songs that does this. The Vietnam War was very divisive. And the sad part about it is that North Vietnam eventually captured South Vietnam in 1975 and unified the country as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which was a communist government. They captured him very shortly after American troops started leaving Vietnam. So most would argue, what was the point of this 20-year war where 58,000 Americans died and 3 million people in total died, for the America to just pull out and the communists take over Vietnam anyways? All right. There were a lot of other proxy wars. I'll talk about these 3 really quickly. There was a crisis in the Congo. If you guys remember, there's always been problems in the Congo with Belgium. Congo finally got its independence from Belgium. It left a power vacuum that the USSR and the USA tried to fill. They didn't want it to become, USSR didn't want it to become capitalist. USA didn't want it to become communist. So the People's Republic of the Congo was a communist government that was trying to take over the Congo, and the USSR, Cuba, and China backed it. The actual government wanted to become democratic, and that was backed by Belgium and the US. This is, again, a very heated controversy because the CIA helped a man named Joseph Mobutu get into power. They helped him do a coup d'etat to come into power, and he does come into power eventually and ruled as a dictator until 1997. So it's like, yeah, we defeated communism, but we put a dictator in charge of the Congo for over 30 years, and he wasn't. The term dictator doesn't typically mean a good ruler, and he wasn't. But again, in our eyes, we defeated the USSR. Ethiopia and Somalia is a super interesting case. There was a war over a land dispute in the Ogaden region. Ethiopia was originally supported by the USA, and Somalia was originally supported uh, by the USSR. Sorry, I mixed those up. But Somalia was originally supported by the USSR. Somalia invades Ethiopia. The USSR is like, hey, you didn't ask our permission to start a war. So they actually start supporting Ethiopia. So then Ethiopia starts supporting, or the USA starts supporting Somalia. They literally flip flop sides of who they supported. The USA only supported Somalia because they wanted to be on the opposite side of the USSR. Ethiopia ends up winning the war, and Somalia hasn't really recovered since then. Then there's the Soviet-Afghan conflict, which happened over a 10-year period between 1979 and 1989. The USSR invaded Afghanistan because Afghanistan was a friendly communist country to the USSR, but they thought they were turning away from communism and turning towards democracy. So they invaded them and basically took over and kept them communist. The USA secretly aided and sponsored Afghan counterattacks, which at that time were known as religious fighters or jihadists. So there's a lot of kind of conspiracy theory people who would say that the USA sponsored jihadists before they really became a bigger deal on the world stage with 9/11. One of those people that conspiracy theorists will say we sponsored was Osama bin Laden. There'd have to be more research into that, and you'd kind of have to form your own opinion on it. Me personally, I don't think that that was the case whatsoever, but a lot of people would say the American government wanted to defeat the USSR so bad that they sponsored an even worse group of people. The USSR does eventually pull out of Afghanistan after suffering heavy financial, political, and human loss. So that, again, that's another conflict where nothing really seems to get solved. So if you've paid any attention, these 5 wars that have happened have literally just been the USA and the USSR kind of competing with each other. Nothing productive really ever came out of any of these wars except bloodshed and more political turmoil. So I really hope that did a good job of painting the picture of what the Cold War was like, what the mindset of each country was, and what the mindset of regular civilians would have been like at that time. Hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you sometime later.